Hey guys, I'm Daniel from ConcerTech, and today we're going to be talking about the iPad Air. I know I said that the iPad Air was the one not to get when it released. It was the iPad 8 that you should get, iPad 8 that you should get. Well, I was terribly wrong, and in this video, hopefully I will show you the reason why that is, and why the iPad Air actually is the one to get. So, I got this for Christmas early, so I've had it for a week now. Actually, a lot more than a week now. And so, this is my initial video, but it's also my weeks later video. Um, Also, I got some accessories. I'll do a separate video on that because there's quite a few of accessories. So yeah, let's get on with my initial thoughts. So I won't be showing you the iPad all the time because I have it right beside me right here as my script device, and I need to be reading that, or else I will just not say anything because I'll just ramble on random things. So I won't be showing it, but it is here. Again, like I said, this is what I use to do scripts, it's what I do to do research, it's what I do to do everything now. So, it's just like my old iPad. It's what I do everything. So, yeah. Touch ID is good, it's fast. It's also good because I'm at school when I use this, mainly. I use it at home now too, but I mainly am at school when I use it. And at least right now, having Face ID is really nice because of masks. So Face ID won't pick up your face, so you have to put in the password. Whereas now, you can just touch the button and it automatically opens because it's Touch ID. Now, when that also poses a problem at home because it's kind of annoying to reach up and hit the button instead of opening instantly when when you're using the keyboard on the iPad Pros, you hit the space bar or something and it opens up instantly because it's reach your face. It doesn't on the iPad Air. You have to reach up, hit the button, and that's it. Which is kind of like, it is a problem. It's also really not a problem. So it's all up to preference, but it's not a problem. Honestly, it's one extra thing, and I've honestly gotten used to it now. It's not that bad. Also, if you're coming, okay, so if you're coming from an iPad Air, if you're going to an iPad Air, sorry, you're probably coming like me from the iPad 5th generation or iPad whatever generation, or an older iPad Air where it has the home button and everything. So you don't really care because you've never had that Face ID option. So you probably don't really care that it has the Touch ID in the top because you're just kind of used to reaching up now. Anyways, so the reason I like it and using it is that it gets compared to the 2020 iPad Pro because there's not much different. All YouTubers are saying the exact same thing, that it's the iPad Pro killer. So I'd have to totally agree with them. Like, it doesn't feel much different except for the part that the screen is faster because it's a 120 hertz display, whereas this is a 60 hertz display. It's a 120 hertz on the iPad Pro. Except for that, which you don't notice, again, like I keep saying, like I'm gonna say this throughout the whole entire video. If you are getting this iPad Air, you're like me. You've had the older generation iPads that have a home button or something like that, and you want to get into the full screen design, but the iPad Pro is a little expensive. So, all these problems that I'm saying aren't really problems for people like us because we're used to them and it's actually better anyways. Whereas these are problems for people going from the Pro to this device. Again, this is a cheaper device, right? Also, your cameras. We'll touch on that further on the video, goes down the specs and stuff like that, but this has worse cameras than the other one does. So first of all, you can get colors in the iPad Air. You can get silver, space gray, rose gold, a green, which is like a really light green, and what's called sky blue, which is a very, very light blue, almost gray color in certain lights, which is kind of good and bad. It doesn't show your color as much, but it doesn't really matter. It's a nice color. I have here space gray is what I have. Oh, and this is, yeah, I kind of spoiler alert on the accessories videos. I got an Apple Pencil, which, I mean, every iPad person does, though. Anyway, so I have the space gray version, and the blue was nice. Actually, when I got this iPad, they had no more iPads Airs available at all. At the Apple Store, at any store, Best Buy, whatever, they had no iPads left except for this one, which is almost exactly what I wanted, actually, because I wanted the space gray anyways. But yeah, it comes in 64 gigabytes and 256 gigabyte models, compared to the iPad Pro having 128, 256, 512, and 1 terabyte. So the only comparable options are really that 256 gigabyte model, which this is the iPad I have is a 256 space gray. So it is the most expensive iPad Air. But at the same time, 64 gigabytes is not usable. My old iPad was 128 gigabytes, so I couldn't go to 64 gigabytes because I was already at my max limit on the old iPad. So 256 is a really good option for me, especially because I don't use it as my, I use it as my main device, but I also have a computer for, really, really big things that I can back up and all that stuff. And I also have the cloud that I can back up to and all that stuff like that. So 256 gigabytes is really not that bad. If you're replacing the iPad with your laptop, I do suggest that 512 and that 1 terabyte would be really good, especially if you're drawing or you're video editing on it or something like that. That is definitely the model to get. 256 it's pushing it. It's not that bad though. I mean, it has USB-C, which I'll get into later, so you can plug in external drives. The iPad Air's weight is 458 grams for the Wi-Fi and an extra 2 grams for the cellular model. So the Pro is a little bit heavier at 471 grams for the Wi-Fi model, and again, 2 extra grams for the cellular model. This new iPad has stereo speakers, so it has 2 speakers but 4 grills. Whereas the iPad Pro has 4 grills and 4 speakers to match those grills. For me, again, the price difference was really good, and I use my AirPods Pro more than half the time when I'm listening to stuff on my iPad, so that didn't really bug me. But if that matters to you, you gotta go for the iPad Pro. The big improvement on the iPad Air is, which I already touched on the up there, is that this iPad has USB-C. Finally, I'm gonna say this multiple times, but I mean, all Apple devices should have this, and the cliche of, they really should. All Apple devices should have it, but we should be honest with ourselves, and we're never gonna get that. So, whatever. Has USB-C, so you can connect hubs and stuff like that. Again, like I was saying about the 256, if you have a hub with, say, a 1 terabyte hard drive, it doesn't really matter anymore that you have 256 because you have a 1 terabyte hard drive. Just pointing that out. I'll get to price and you'll see what I'm talking about. It has a magnetic connector for the Gen 2 pencil. Using the Gen 2 pencil, I highly suggest the Gen 2 pencil over the iPad or the Gen 1 pencil, because the Gen 1 pencil has, you have to plug it into the side of the iPad, into the lightning port, for it to charge, for it to do whatever you want, whereas it just is always charging on the iPad, and it's like literally the perfect spot for it. It's where you'd put your Gen 1, except your Gen 1 wouldn't be charging there, so it's perfect. So this has a 10.9-inch display, which makes it pretty much the same body and screen size as the iPad Pro 11-inch. It is a little bit thicker bezels. If you have them side by side, you notice it. If you don't have them side by side, you don't notice it. Again, same with the screens. This has a 60 hertz screen, whereas the iPad Pro has something called Pro Motion Display, which is 120 hertz. Again, it's kind of like the screen size. You don't notice it unless they're side by side, or you're used to that 120 hertz display. So, yeah. The iPad Air uses an A14 Bionic chip instead of the A12Z, which is in the Pros, which is what the Pros use. And so that, what that means, I'm going to get a little geek on you, but it's okay. What that means is the A12Z has 8 CPUs and GPU cores, whereas the A14 Bionic chip has 6 CPU cores and 4 GPU cores. What also helps it though is it's a 5 nanometer chip over a 7 nanometer chip. So to say that in like English terms, is basically means things like video editing should be better on the iPad Pro, and the iPad Air is basically just a newer CPU. So it has better day-to-day things, easier, and it's less battery used. But in the real world, it makes no difference. You don't notice the worst performance of the A14 Bionic chip because the OS is optimized the same thing via both. The only time you notice it is when you hook up an external monitor, which I really noticed when I hooked up an external monitor to the iPad Air. That's when it gets a little chunky. The GPU just doesn't have enough cores. But it's a 5 nanometer chip, so it's better for like day to day. Honestly, for something that an iPad would be used for, they're both perfectly fine. On the camera's side, the new iPad Pros 2020 have a wide angle lens, a LiDAR scanner, and then a normal 12 megapixel camera, which the iPad Air just has that 12 megapixel camera. If you look at the back of the iPad Air, it looks like a last gen iPad Pro. It looks identical actually, because I'm pretty sure they use the same body and stuff. That's why it's cheap. In the front, they both have a 7 megapixel camera for FaceTime calls, and different video meetings, and I've tried it with a bunch of different video meetings, and it's a really, really good camera. It's good enough for anything. The only problem with it is it's an iPad, so it's on the side of the display instead of being on the top. So you kind of gotta shift it a little weird, and so your camera angle is a little weird. But other than that, it's perfectly fine. It also has 2 mics for calls, unlike the iPad Pro has 5. Both Air and Pros both have Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.0, but that's just kind of something the 2020 things and now 2021 things will all have. The Air has a Touch ID sensor, which I already touched on this. Then the iPad Pro having Face ID. It's not that bad. Like I already said above, schools, masks, but it's also a little bit annoying because you gotta touch up, stuff like that. In tablet mode, it doesn't make a difference at all because you're holding the iPad, you just gotta, oh, Touch ID's done. Oh, Face ID's done. It's the exact same thing. So it all depends on if you really, really need that Face ID or if you're fine with Touch ID. I'm fine with Touch ID. That's just my opinion. Both iPad Air and Pros both have the same 10-hour battery life of searching the web and watching videos, and 9 hours for the cellular models. So, same battery. In the real world, I think the iPad Air should have a little bit of a better battery just because that CPU is working a little bit less. But, yeah. So lastly, we're going to talk about that price tag because that's what the whole Air thing was about, right? So the 64 gigabyte starts at $779 Canadian, and the 256 is $979 Canadian, and then $170 more for the cellular models on both those prices. So $979. It's pretty cheap. That's all I'm gonna say for now because I'm gonna touch on this. First, the bad, because there isn't much of the bad except for that Touch ID that I keep talking to you about. But like I said up top, like I said at the beginning of the video, mostly everyone coming on this iPad Air device is going to be coming from an iPad 5th generation, iPad 6th generation, an iPad Air 2, an iPad Air whatever. They're going to be coming from those kind of devices, even a mini, those kind of devices, and then upgrading from that. They're not going to go from a Pro all the way down to an Air. That wouldn't make sense, unless it's the old Pros with the Touch ID and the home button still. So, back onto that price tag. It is $200 cheaper than the comparable Pro. So I'm comparing the 256 gigabyte, the 11-inch, and the 11-inch. Or just 10.9-inch and the 11-inch. The Air only comes in one size, but that's fine. So that's what I'm comparing them to. So it's $200 cheaper for the iPad Air. So, that $200 could get you an iPad, an Apple Pencil, because they're $169 is an Apple Pencil. So $200 goes towards that, and it means you can have the device, the Apple Pencil, and say any keyboard you want for $200 cheaper than you would for the comparable iPad Pro. $200 is a significant difference. It really is. I'll talk about more about both of the accessories that I have in a later video, but yeah, it's $200. I mean, you can do a lot with $200, in my opinion. So, to just wrap it all up, and I'm gonna probably repeat myself multiple times, but it's just kind of a one big thing of everything that I just said. I strongly recommend this device, of course, because someone coming from an old Air or any other cheap devices like the iPad 5th generation, like I've been saying, and stuff like that, that aren't the Pros. So you don't need that Face ID, you don't need the bigger cameras that I personally never would use because my iPhone 11 has 2 cameras on it and I don't really care about my iPad Pro having the same basic camera setup, and LiDAR I'd never use. Or you're someone that was looking at the Pros because of the USB-C port, and the Apple Pencil 2 is just that much better, and maybe the Magic Keyboard you wanted because everyone's saying it's the best keyboard ever, right? Ever, but the Pro price tag was like, I can get a MacBook Air for the exact same price once you get all that stuff onto that iPad Pro. If you're that same person, I was that. If you're that person, I was the exact same person. But I just couldn't justify the price, and that's why I made that video about the iPad 8th generation as the iPad for everyone to get, because it was that much cheaper. But when you actually really think about things, it really isn't. But if you need, because it really isn't, but if you need that 12.9-inch iPad, or you're coming from an old iPad Pro, so you need that, you want the same Pro upgrade, right? You want that LiDAR scanner for designing something, right? You want the higher storage. You want all that stuff. Well, then this is the iPad. The iPad Pro is the iPad to get, but this is the iPad for most people to get. It is a significant price tag, right? Once you get that Magic Keyboard, you would get the iPad, you get the Apple Pencil. It climbs up to like $1,500, $1,600, which is expensive. I completely understand that. But the comparable iPad Pro is $200 more than that, which is getting into MacBook territory. The iPad Air still isn't getting into MacBook territory. So you're still getting a really, really good device. You also can do a lot more things on an iPad than you can, for me personally, on a MacBook. If you have a desktop device like I do, all you need is an iPad as your traveling laptop, because it's just amazing the amount of things you can do on it. You can just draw on it. Then you can type on it. Then you can play games on it, just like on your iPhone. You can do so much stuff on an iPad, and I can't like say it enough of how much iPads are really used. But accessories really help with that, and I will talk about that in my accessory video. Like, mainly that whole video is going to be about how accessories make the iPad a laptop, because it really does. But this is just about the iPad Air, and if you're just using it as an iPad, it's a good iPad, but it's kind of starting to be like a pro device now. Whereas the iPad Air and the iPad Pro, if you don't want to get the Apple Pencil, you don't want to get the Magic Keyboard, and you still only want the 11-inch iPad Pro or the just regular iPad Air, I strongly suggest you to just get the iPad 8, because if you're just using it as an iPad every day to play games or something like that, watch videos or something like that, it is a cheaper device to get. This is the device for, you have the iPad 8, and you also have the Mini. The iPad 8 and the iPad Mini are the same. You want the iPad Mini, you want a small device to watch your movies, to play your games, stuff like that. The iPad 8, you want a little bit bigger of a device to do the exact same things. Then you have the big iPad Pro, which for the 11-inch is kind of not really worth it at this moment in time until the new iPad Pros come out, because the iPad Air is here. But you're thinking, oh, I want the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. I want 1 terabyte of hard drive. I'm gonna mate it to the pencil, the iPad, the Magic Keyboard. I'm gonna use this as my laptop. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But I also want the 12.9-inch display, because movies are gonna be amazing on this thing. Or you want the iPad Air, which is kind of like the middle ground. It's still kind of cheap. It's $200 cheaper than that iPad Pro comparison, or iPad Pro comparison, yeah. But the iPad Pro and the iPad Air are both devices that, if you're thinking about drawing, if you're thinking about the Magic Keyboard, they're the devices to get. If you're not, though, they're not really that worth it anymore, because they're so optimized for the Apple Pencil, for the Magic Keyboard, that it almost doesn't make sense to not have those accessories on it. But I could ramble on for multiple times about this, and how an iPad could be used as a laptop and stuff like that. But yeah, to cut it very, very short, the iPad Air is the person that wants an iPad Pro, but they don't like the price tag. Get an iPad Air. That's it. That's plain simple. It is the iPad Pro killer. I totally 100% agree with that. It is the iPad Pro killer. Thanks for watching.